Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition of my translation of the Gospel of Mark. We've come to chapter 6 and verse 32, where the Lord is going to multiply the bread and fish for 5,000 men, besides women and children. So I will now read to begin verses 32 through 34. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a deserted place, but many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and arrived before them and came together to him. Well, upon disembarking, Jesus saw a large crowd and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Just so far for the moment. I need to explain one minor detail. It doesn't make much difference, but verse 33, many saw them going and recognized them. There's an even split in the attestation. Half the Greek manuscripts have them, and the other half have him. But the best line of transmission, which is what I have translated, has them. Just think about this a minute. Just consider if the fishing boat were setting out to fish, there would not be 13 men in it. Okay? Got that? Also, the boat was known, and there was only one large group of men like that going around together. The people would not have to single out Jesus to know who they were. So, them is correct. Just, just your Bible probably says him. You have to understand what happened here. There's a large bay between Capernaum and Tiberias. That's where they went to, just above Tiberias. So they stayed on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, but there's a large bay there, and that's a number of miles across there, about 10 miles probably. But although they are crossing straight across the mouth of the bay, but people on the shore could run along and keep even with them like in a marathon. Now, just from the direction the boat took, okay, if the boat goes in a given direction heading straight south with 13 men in it, they're not going to fish, all right? Well, they would have a pretty good idea that that's where they were going. And unless the boat had a really good tailwind, and especially if they had to row, people on the shore could easily outrun the boat, no problem, just like in a marathon, even though they would in fact be covering a greater distance, somewhat going around the outside of the curve. Well, just like in a marathon, the faster runners would be up front, and then the next one. So there'd be people scattered over quite a range, so that any latecomers could see the straggler, what they could say, "Hey, what's going on?" and they could join the crowd. The faster runners got there before the boat did. And it says here in verse 33, right? Arrived before them. That's what the text says right here. And came together to him. That's them. They wouldn't know just exactly what point the boat was going to touch at. Okay, so but they see the boat and they know that they're either even with it or ahead of it or so on. But when the boat actually comes in and ties up on the land, then of course if someone's already up above it, gone beyond, then they come back and whatnot. They've gathered to him. No problem. That's exactly the way it was. But people kept arriving, people kept arriving, people kept arriving. So by the end of the day, there were 5,000 men, besides women and children. So probably there were over 10,000 people there. Now, the Lord's whole purpose in going there was to get away and be by himself. They didn't want the crowd. The crowd frustrated his plan. But instead of being angry, Jesus simply felt compassion for them. Sheep like me, I would probably have gotten angry. I don't like I don't like frustration too much. So, well, but not the Lord Jesus. And he began to teach them. Okay, let's go on now and read verses 35 through 38. When it was late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send them away so they may go to the surrounding farms and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But in reply, he said to them, "You feed them." They say to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and feed them?" So he says to them, "Well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see." When they knew, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now then, you can understand the disciples, okay? This is not that this crowd was not in the plan. They simply don't have any way of taking care of that many people. So when they say to Jesus here, "Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding farms and villages and buy themselves bread," that was an obvious cop-out. Look, the surrounding area would not have enough extra bread to feed 10,000 people at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, even if any surrounding little town, even if there were some bread stores or if someone made bread to sell, you do that early morning because people want their bread with their coffee in the morning. And so by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, any bread that any bread store had made or played, it would be gone. And no farmer, no one has that kind of no kind of food ready to handle all that many people. There just wasn't any solution for that. Normally, send them to the surrounding. That was a cop out. They just wanted to get rid of the problem. But all of a sudden, it gets worse. Jesus says, "You feed them." Well, there's no way they could expect that response, since humanly speaking, that was totally ridiculously impossible. I want to think about that just a little bit more, but first, um, in the end, the solution would pass through their hands, as we will see. But unless the Lord here was joking, which I doubt very much, he was telling them to perform a miracle. The only solution for that situation was a miracle like Jesus performed. And Jesus was telling the disciples to perform the miracle. That's what Jesus was saying. You guys do it. Do what? Well, they would have to do a miracle because otherwise they're simply, what are you going to do with 5 little loaves and 2 fish? It's ridiculous. And they had never before seen this done. So Jesus was asking them to do something that they had never seen before. Oh dear. Let's go ahead and read now verses 39 through 44. Then he directed them all to recline in groups on the green grass. So they reclined in plots of hundreds and fifties, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to serve the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Well, they all ate and were filled, and they picked up 12 full baskets of broken pieces, also of the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves for the moment. Let's Let's just pause and try to recall that scene. Imagine it. The sacred text affirms plainly that there were about 5,000 men. You get this, and there's several accounts. This is one of the few things that all four Gospels record. It's one of the very few places that all four Gospels handle, because John normally brought out new stuff that none of the others had. And it's very clear. You look at all, there were 5,000 men without counting women and children. Well, whenever you see a crowd of people, what is there usually the most of? Isn't it women and children? In other words, I suppose that crowd was made up of maybe at least 15,000, certainly at least 10,000. Okay, now you try to imagine, please, that you are one of those 12 disciples. And you have just heard the Master say, "You feed them." With what, please? They didn't have anything. What in the world? As a matter of fact, they didn't have anything. Even the 5 ribs and 2 fish, they were belonged to a little boy there. They didn't belong to the disciples. Then they probably didn't even have that much money, 200 denarii to buy, but there wouldn't have been that much food around to buy, even if you had the money at that time in that place. No, I ask you, really, let's think about this. Can it be that Jesus was really playing a joke on them? Or was he serious? I don't know. I personally prefer to think that he would not make a joke out of such a situation. But if he was serious, how could the disciples obey? Only with a miracle, obvious. That's the only way out. In fact, they could not see a solution, so they gave the problem back to Jesus to solve, which he did. But did Jesus himself hand the bread and fish to the crowd? No. Let us think about that scene a little bit more. We'll see that the disciples still had to exercise faith. The record affirms that they all ate until they were full or satisfied. And it was not just a little something to tide them over or to deceive their stomachs. Have you ever considered how much bread and fish it would take to fill 15,000 people or even 10,000 people? And they probably hadn't had any lunch either. They'd been there most of the time, most of the day. It seems to me certain that when Jesus blessed and broke those loaves of fish, there was not an instant multiplication, such that there was enough for everyone. The tremendous pile would have buried Jesus, the disciples, and the closest of the people. Think about it. How much would there need to feed to fill up at least 10,000 people, maybe 15,000? No. It could not, you're right, it was not instantaneous. That means that when Jesus placed some bread and fish in the hands of each disciple, that was all there was up to that moment. So here you are, you're one of the 12, and you have a little bit of bread and fish in your hand. And you have to take care of about 1,000 people, give or take. Okay? 10 or more thousand people, 12 disciples. Wouldn't you feel just a little bit ridiculous? Come on. What are you going to do? You got 1,000 people to take care of, and you got a handful of bread and fish. Oh, dear me. How are you going to have the courage to take that first step in the direction of the crowd? Like, but anyway, they did. And so you come to the first person, and that person takes them, and then still there, and so on. It never quit. And probably the disciples did not go one by one. Probably the people then started breaking it and handing it, breaking it and handing it, breaking and handing it, because otherwise it would have taken forever to get through all those people. And then, of course, picking up the pieces afterwards. There were obviously an awful lot of pieces all over the place. The only explanation I can see is that although the disciples had to start the process of it, they had to have the faith to go to the first person and say, here, take some and so on. But then the idea spread and so on. That's the way I see it. If they had stopped in the middle, half the people would have gone hungry, but they didn't. I say if the disciples, they were hungry too, all right. The disciples were hungry. If they decided to eat first, they would have finished it all off and that would have been it. Nothing left for the other people. No, the disciples had to wait until eat at the end. There were 12 disciples and they picked up 12 large baskets of fragments. So there was one basket of food for each disciple. Have you ever tried eating a large basket of bread all by yourself? They ate at the end, but they ate very well. Thank you very much. I laugh a little bit, but if you had been one of those 12 disciples, you were in a serious situation. Okay, but it came out all right in the end. Notice that the Lord was very insistent not to waste anything. You might, anyone who can multiply, no problem. Nope, he said, you pick up all the pieces. But we get in a parallel passage, the disciples didn't keep all that bread and fish, because when the Lord tells them to beware of the leaven of the scribes, they think, we don't have any bread. Oh, come on. Have you ever thought, where did Jesus get all those large baskets, like 12 baskets to pick up the pieces? How? Probably, this was just a little bit, not too far from the town of Tiberias, and Tiberias would have fishermen there, and probably fishing boats. They have a huge crowd of people. We got to see what this is. So there were probably a number of fishing boats from Tiberias that were just off the shore, taking it all in. And they were the ones who lent their baskets, and probably they got their baskets back with all the food in it. So that was a good deal for them. They didn't lose anything by that gesture of goodwill. This, by the way, also probably wasn't just the disciples who did the picking up. At least not by themselves. They doubtless had help. Okay. The other parallel accounts make pretty clear it wasn't just the men. There were 5,000 men, but there were also women and children. Okay. Let's just read verses now 45 and 46. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after taking leave of them, he went up the mountain to pray. Now, I have a detailed discussion about the location, about was it Bethsaida or was it Tiberias and so on. It's in the appendix. I should have gotten hold of that probably. Let me see if I can find that real quick. This is a lack of preparation on my part, for which I beg your pardon. But this bit about whether it was Tiberias or Bethsaida is a bit of a problem. And some people have alleged that this was a mistake in the Bible, argued against the inspiration of the Bible on that basis. Let me see here if I can find it. Yeah. Bethsaida or Tiberias, number 8, page 603. Sorry, Alan, I didn't warn you about this one. It's Luke against John. In the exposition of Luke, I've already taken care of it, but now we are here in Mark. No, well, we're in Mark, but also Luke and then John. And they have they talk about different places, like Bethsaida is up on the north side of the lake, just on the east side of whatever that little stream is that comes in, if it's still the Jordan River. Whereas Tiberias is on the western side and not very far above where the Jordan River goes out the bottom of the lake. So we do have a seeming difficulty here. Well, I'm going to read now this is in the third edition of my translation. The question is, just where did the feeding of the 5,000 men take place? Matthew 14:13 and Mark 6:32 merely say it was in a deserted spot without identification. Although Mark does say people ran along the shore, which would have to be that bay. Okay. But Luke 9 verse 10 says it was in a deserted place belonging to a town named Bethsaida. While John 6:23 informs us that the spot was near the town of Tiberias. Well, Tiberias is up there, and is down here, and Bethsaida is up there. It's one or the other. We may deduce from Mark 6:31 and John 6:17 and verse 24 that Jesus and his disciples started out from Capernaum, where Jesus had his base of operations. It happens that Capernaum, like Bethsaida, was situated at the top of the sea, but a little to the west of the entrance of the Jordan. To go from Capernaum, now here's the point, to go from Capernaum to Bethsaida by boat, one would not get far from the shore, you just go right along the shore. But John 6:1 says that Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee. And that agrees better with Tiberias, since there's a large bay between Capernaum and Tiberias. Well, he crossed about 10 miles of water, and that's a fair amount of water, all right. Further, after the feast, Matthew 14:22 says they went by boat to the other side. And verse 24 has them in the middle of the sea. While Mark 6:45 says that they went by boat to the other side to Bethsaida. That's where I just was here. And verse 47 in Mark has them in the middle of the sea. And John 6:17 says that they started to cross the sea toward Capernaum. And verse 19, they had rowed some 3 or 4 miles. Well, now, to stay close to the shore is one thing, to go over the sea is another. Further, if they were already in or near Bethsaida, how could they cross the sea in order to get there? Mark 6:45. It becomes clear that the miracle, in fact, took place near Tiberias, as John affirms, but that raises another difficulty. How could a property near Tiberias belong to Bethsaida? Luke chapter 9, verse 10. Either it had been deeded to the town somehow, or more likely, as I imagine, it belonged to a family that lived in Bethsaida. And my reason for saying that is based on the text. John 6:17 says they started toward Capernaum. Well, Mark 6:45 says that they went to Bethsaida. Well, since the two towns were a short distance apart, at the beginning of the crossing, starting out from Tiberias, the direction would be virtually the same. I understand that they did indeed go to Bethsaida, but spent very little time there, going from there directly to Genesaret. Indeed, the day after the miracle, Jesus was already back in Capernaum, John 6:24 and 5. But just why did they make that side trip to Bethsaida? Genesaret lies just south of Capernaum. I imagine the following. A property near Tiberias, but belonging to someone in Bethsaida, would likely be deserted, a great place for a picnic. I suppose that Jesus had permission to use that place when he wanted to get away. That's where they were going. But no one had foreseen a crowd of, 15,000, 5,000 men plus women and children. please, pardon the unpleasant consideration, but what effect would a crowd of that size have on the hygiene of the place and the appearance of the place? Have you thought about that? You know, that many people, they have to be relieving themselves from time to time. Have you ever thought about that? I conclude that Jesus felt obligated to give a report to the owner in the city. So that's where they went there first. While we are here, allow me to call attention to another miracle that Jesus performed that you will not find in the usual lists. As already noted, Matthew 14:24 and Mark 6:46 say they were in the middle of the sea. This is after the feeding, okay? But John 6:19 is more precise, saying that they had gone perhaps 4 miles. It happens that a crossing from Tiberias to Bethsaida would involve just about 8 miles. So if they are in the middle of the sea, that's where they were, 4 miles out, 4 miles from either shore. Now attention please to John chapter 6 and verse 21. Then they wanted to receive him into the boat. Jesus went walking on the water, remember? They wanted to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Okay, they're 4 miles out. And immediately the boat is on the shore. That means Jesus transported that boat 4 miles instantly. No, look, that was a fair-sized miracle, okay? Would you grant that? That was a fair-sized miracle? Just transported, and that was a large boat. That was a large fishing boat. I had a whole bunch of people in it. But even a small boat, 4 miles instantly. You won't find this in most lists because very few people take time to really analyze the text. Okay, I'm sorry, Alan, I didn't warn you about that. But the trouble is that people use this, that seeming discrepancy to argue against the inspiration of the text, and I'm here to work against that. Okay, now I'm back, please, to Mark. And he sends the boat ahead to Bethsaida. That's what I had to stop and talk about it because they are near Tiberias, and he sends them across the lake up to Bethsaida. But immediately then they leave and go to Genesaret because the next day that's where he is, and in Capernaum. And I felt we needed an explanation of why such just a quick trip. I just go there, touch base, and take off. All right. But he goes up on the mountain to pray. Now, I will now talk about the walk on the water. I got ahead of myself there a bit, but that's okay. You can follow the action. Let's read now verses 47 through 52. A walk on water. Now, when evening had passed, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw them straining at rowing because the wind was against them. Well, about the 4th watch of the night, he comes to them walking on the water, and would have passed by them. But they saw him walking on the water, supposed he was a ghost, and yelled, because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were totally astounded within themselves and kept marveling, because they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts had been hardened. Okay, that much for the moment. Now, notice what it says here. About the 4th watch of the night. This is Roman time, and it was about 3 a.m. Verse 48 says that Jesus saw them straining at rowing. The wind was contrary. If the wind is contrary, you can't use your sails, right? You have to row, and that was a heavy boat. Okay, it's at night, all right, and they are about 4 miles away out in the middle. So how could Jesus see them? Well, supernatural vision, obviously, a supernatural thing. Dead of night, 3 o'clock in the morning, he sees them, 4 miles away. It's a good trick, huh? Now, have you thought about that just a little bit? Jesus sent them away, and Jesus knew what was going to happen. So Jesus deliberately sent them to a bad night. They had been rowing for maybe 9 hours. Okay, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. They were tired. That had been a bad night. All right. The day was a very interesting day, thank you, but the night, God does that to us sometimes. God sends us into uncomfortable situations, difficult situations, bothersome situations. You know that happened? Yeah, that does. And this was on, Jesus did it. He sent them on ahead. He could have let them stay there and wait, and he could have just moved the whole thing over later at his wish, like he did with the second half. All right. So he comes walking. And he doesn't aim directly at the boat. He's deliberately aiming so that he'll go past it, but he's obviously very nicely close enough for them to see him. And he may have actually been in white or something so that it helps them to see him. They saw him. They all saw him, and they thought it was a ghost. Well, of course, how often do you see someone walking on the water? Okay, I would have thought it was a ghost too. I think people just don't walk on water. All right. He wanted to set up the situation. You may remember Matthew says that Peter took a little walk. Right? This one not mentioned here. Probably Peter was at Mark's elbow while he wrote this apostle, and so it's not mentioned here. It is in Matthew, as I recall. Peter took a little walk, but here they just let him come into the boat. Immediately the wind ceased. So John is the one who says that the boat immediately was transported to where they're going, which was Bethsaida. But notice what it says here in verse 52. It says that their hearts had been hardened. Who hardened their hearts? It's passive voice. I don't know. They didn't get the point. If you can multiply 5 loaves and 2 fish like that, that is supernatural power. All right, that is supernatural power. And handling a storm is supernatural power, and so on and such supernatural power. And of course, John says the boat was transported immediately to the shore. Okay, let's read now about Genesaret. This occupies verses 53 through 56, which will finish chapter 6. After they had crossed over, they came to the land of Genesaret and anchored there. When they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized them, and running about the whole surrounding region, they began to carry about on their pallets those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. Whenever he entered into villages, towns, or countryside, they would place the sick in the marketplaces, and they would beg him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And all who touched him were healed. This is a cover statement that we get here in Mark. At least in John, it says plainly that the next day Jesus was back in Capernaum, and then the people asked him, "Yeah, it was John." Because there were some guys that slept on the beach when Jesus was up in the mountain. They wanted to make Jesus king. But all of a sudden he wasn't there anymore. So in the morning, then they took some of the fishing boats, whatever, and got to Capernaum. But that same day, Jesus is there. And in John, you will have the exchange between them and Jesus in Capernaum the next morning. So obviously, they did not spend much time in Bethsaida. But it was 3 o'clock in the morning. They were only halfway across. Then the Lord, of course, moved them the rest of the way. But even so, you probably have to wait until dawn before you wake someone up to tell them that you messed up their picnic spot on the other side. But even so, once they had told the person, they would then get in the boat and come and get to Genesaret. And Jesus got back to Capernaum in time for the dialogue you will find in John. Okay. Again in verse 53, they crossed over. When they got back to Genesaret, the people, you have to understand that the people were desperate. They didn't have hospitals like we have. They didn't have medicine like we have. There were doctors, but the doctors were very limited in what they knew what to do. People were just desperate. So wherever, anyone like Jesus who could heal anything, now he could heal anything. They just went from all over. But I asked myself, how come there were so many sick people all the time? Because you have hundreds and thousands of people getting healed all the time. How does this work? Were they getting demonized? Was the sickness being produced by demons? Very, very curious business. But of course, ever since Abraham, Satan knew that God had a very special purpose for that particular real estate, and you may be sure that Satan has always spent plenty of attention on that bit of real estate over there. Anyway, here we find the people just touching his garment, and that's all you had to do. He didn't have to touch, they just touched his garment and they were healed. It happened over and over again, actually. Okay, now we come to chapter 7. I'll just read verses 1 through 4 to begin. Now we have Jesus and some scribes and Pharisees. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes gathered where he was, having come from Jerusalem. He's in Capernaum, already coming from Jerusalem. And upon seeing some of his disciples eating bread with unclean, that is ceremonially unwashed hands, they found fault. Because the Pharisees, indeed all the Jews, do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. There are many other things that they have received and hold, like washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. All verses 3 and 4 are in parentheses in my translation, so well, those Pharisees and scribes, if they came from Jerusalem, they were a long way from home. You look at the map. Matter of fact, there's a map behind me. It's a long way from here to there, all right? If you were doing that on foot. They were just determined to get rid of Jesus, and they were ready to spend time and money and effort to get information, anything they could use. And here they, of course, they're complaining because his disciples weren't washing their hands in the prescribed way. They might have been washing their hands, but not in the right way. There was a very special procedure that they used. And in because Mark was writing for a Roman audience, he takes time here to explain a little bit about the Pharisees. This would not have been necessary if you're writing for Jews like Matthew. Oh, he tells him these. In fact, all the Jews, they have this business about all the tradition of the elders, and to wash your hands, so on, cups, pitchers, even couches. Okay, Mark is just thinking of his pretended audience. Well, he has to explain a few things about Jews. Jews are just a little bit different. Now, verse 5 through, let's see where we're going to go. I'm going to read all the way to verse 13. This is still Jesus dealing with those guys. Then the scribes and the, sorry, I didn't read that right. Then the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with unwashed hands? So in answer, he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it stands written, quote, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they venerate me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. End quote from Isaiah. Because having left the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men, washings of pitchers and cups and many other things you do. End quote. Indeed, he said to them, another quote, you are very good at nullifying the commandment of God so that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man should say to father or mother, whatever you might have received from me is korban, that is, a gift to God, you do not even allow him to do anything for his father or his mother anymore, making the word of God of no effect by your tradition that you have handed down. Yes, you do many such things. End quote. For the moment. Well, you notice that Jesus doesn't spend any time trying to mollify them or pacify them. They, you see, were using their tradition as an instrument of domination, to dominate the people, to control the people. And Jesus, of course, was challenging that control. And of course, the big boys didn't appreciate that. They didn't like that. Well, notice in verse 6, he says, he calls them hypocrites, right to their face. Why? Because Jesus knew perfectly well who they were and what they were about. Okay, he knew they were there, why they were there. So he doesn't make any effort to conciliate them. He knows that he'd be wasting his time. They aren't there to be conciliated. They're there to find things against him. He knows that. He knew that. Well, now he cites Isaiah. It's Isaiah 29, verse 13. Now, none of our churches have doctrines that are mere commandments of men. That doesn't happen. Your church doesn't have any doctrines that are just commandments of men. If you do, all such worship is vain. Sovereign Jesus saying that. Oh, now Jesus gets right at them. He says, you guys have left the commandment of God. You're putting your tradition above. You're making people obey what you think they want. Now he gives a specific example of how they, the Pharisees and those guys, are nullifying God's commandment. Because God said, honor your father and mother. If you speak evil of them, you get put to death. That's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and chapter 21, verse 17. But now he gets on to what they have done. You guys say, if a man should say to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received me is korban, then you don't let him do anything more for his parents. Okay. That was dirty, all right? We need to ask the question. Where did all those goods and money go? The korban that people were giving to them, where did that money go? It went right into their pockets, presumably. Where else would it go? You can't send it up to God, right? Okay, you can't do that. So they use it down here and they use it for themselves, sure. But what they were really doing, they were stealing from the old people. They were stealing from the elderly. That's what they were doing. They were dirty, that they were just plain dirty. And so, verse 13, Jesus said, you are making the word of God of no effect by your tradition. Not good, bad. You guys do money. So he's proving, as a matter of fact, that they were hypocrites. He gives them a very concrete example. Okay, now let's see what else we have here. Let's read verses 14 and 15. Upon summoning the larger crowd, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing outside a man that can defile him by going into him. Rather, the things that come out of him, those are the ones that defile him. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. I really have to read on, but let's just stop here quickly. As the following context here makes clear, the Lord was talking only about food, not about other things, all right? People are constantly being contaminated by things they see and they hear and so on, but the Lord wasn't talking about that. He's talking about stuff that goes in your mouth. As the context will make clear, if anyone has to hear, let him hear. About 1% of the Greek manuscripts of objectively inferior quality omit verse 16 altogether, as in most versions. Better stay with the 99% of better manuscripts. Okay, let's read now verses 17 through 23. And he's still talking about defiling. When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples started to question him about that parable. So he said to them, can you really be without understanding? Don't you perceive that nothing that enters a man from outside can defile him? Because it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, which then expels the impure aspects of the food. He went on to say, that which comes out of a man, that is what defiles him, because from within, out of men's hearts, the evil designs proceed. Adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetings, malignancies, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, arrogance, foolishness. All these malignant things proceed from within and defile the man. That's right, by the way. Now, let's go back quickly here. The way I translated verse 19 is probably not quite what you are used to. It's a little bit difficult to handle that particular verse. It's talking about the food, right? It doesn't go into your heart, it goes into your stomach. So what happens once the food gets in your stomach? A literal rendering, if I just really said just word for word, is then into the latrine, thus making all foods clean. But you know good and well that a latrine doesn't make anything clean, right? That's not what a latrine does. I take it that Jesus was referring to the process in the stomach having a purifying effect, since, of course, the sewer does just the opposite. Perhaps 10% of the Greek manuscripts end the quote after latrine and have Jesus declaring all foods to be clean. That's not what it was. It's not what he said. So that's why I rendered it that way. The stomach expels the impure aspects of the food. That was what I consider to be the end point of what the Lord said there. But obviously it's what's inside our evil hearts. That's what defiles us, okay? Now he talks about what's in our evil hearts. Adultery, fornication, again, these are two different things. You see it here. Adultery is one thing, fornication is something else. Not the same. Fornication does not include adultery. Murders, thefts, covetings, malignancies, deceit, lewdness, oh dear me, evil eye, foolishness. arrogance, bad company. Those are the things that defile them. Of course, the Pharisees did not want to hear that. Maybe we don't always want to hear it either. But it's our nasty heart that defiles us. It's not stuff that of course, if you're taking drugs, that will certainly have a negative effect upon you, but it's not a moral defiling. It doesn't defile you morally speaking. It may do bad things to your body and whatnot. But these things that he mentions here, all these obvious types of sin, evil, these are morally corrupting. These are morally defiling. Those are the things that defile a person. Well, the next story is a very interesting one, and I'm going to save it now for the next video where we have a crumb for a little dog. That's next. Thanks for watching, and God bless.